there is a file that was never supposed to exist. It wasn't a document. It wasn't a message. It wasn't a trace left out of carelessness or negligence. According to every system log, every access record, every forensic scan conducted after the fact, this file should not have been there, and yet it was. Time-stamped, intact, sitting in a directory that no one had touched in over 2 years. The man who created it had already vanished. And that's the part that investigators keep coming back to. Not the disappearance itself, which was calculated, deliberate, and clean enough that the FBI's cyber division spent months chasing dead ends. Not the aliases, not the offshore infrastructure, not the encrypted communications that went cold overnight like a heartbeat stopping mid-sentence. What they keep coming back to is this: a person intelligent enough to build and then dismantle an entire digital identity, someone who understood operational security at a level most federal agents never reach, left behind exactly one thing, one file, in a location that should have been swept, at a time that doesn't fit the timeline, with metadata pointing somewhere it shouldn't point. Either this was an accident, or it was something else entirely. This is the case of the man who called himself Vanta. Nobody knew his real name at first. In the underground forums where he operated, forums that existed on the margins of the indexed internet, accessible through layered authentication and invitation-only gateways, he was simply Vanta. No profile photo, no personal details, no digital footprint that connected to anything traceable in the conventional sense. What he had instead was a reputation. And in the specific ecosystem where that reputation lived, a reputation like his was worth more than any credential. He was not a criminal in the most obvious sense. He didn't sell drugs. He didn't threaten individuals. He didn't run the kind of low-sophistication fraud operations that fill federal case files every year. Phishing campaigns, credential dumps, social engineering targeted at elderly victims. What Vanta did was considerably more technical, considerably more methodical, and considerably harder to prosecute because the line between what he offered and what is legal shifts depending on jurisdiction, intent, and how carefully you read the fine print. He sold access, not to systems he had hacked, not to stolen data. He sold knowledge, and specifically the kind of knowledge that allows someone to understand how enterprise-level security infrastructure actually fails. Penetration testing methodologies so advanced they bordered on classified. Exploit frameworks designed for environments most cybersecurity professionals never encounter. Architecture documentation for systems that, in the wrong hands, become roadmaps to something much darker. His clients, according to what investigators were later able to piece together, ranged from gray market corporate espionage contractors to state-adjacent actors in jurisdictions where oversight was a theoretical concept. He was not just skilled, he was precise. He understood exactly how much to sell, to whom, and through what channels to avoid the kind of paper trail that tends to end careers and begin prison sentences. For roughly 4 years, he operated without a single confirmed breach of his own security. No identity leak. No physical location compromise. No former associate who turned informant. No metadata slip. Nothing. And then, in a 72-hour window in March 2022, he was gone. Not arrested. Not publicly identified. Gone. His forum presence was deleted. Then the forum itself went dark. The cryptocurrency wallets associated with his known transactions were emptied and then abandoned. The infrastructure he used, a rotating network of virtual private servers distributed across 7 countries, went offline in a sequence so coordinated that forensic analysts initially assumed it was an automated script executing a pre-planned shutdown protocol. Every layer of his operation collapsed inward like a building being deliberately demolished. Systematic, sequenced, rehearsed. By the time the relevant agencies coordinated enough to issue cross-jurisdictional alerts, there was functionally nothing left to find. But here is where things start to change. 3 weeks after the shutdown, a security researcher based in Rotterdam, working independently, unaffiliated with any government agency, was conducting a routine audit of an old research archive. Not a sensitive archive, not a classified environment. A semi-public academic repository used by cybersecurity professionals to store technical papers, proof of concept code, and documentation related to vulnerability research. The kind of place that doesn't generate headlines. The kind of place that doesn't have a dedicated security team watching every directory in real time. She found the file. It was sitting in a subdirectory that hadn't been actively maintained in roughly 26 months. The file itself was small, unremarkable in size, the kind of thing that would pass unnoticed in any automated scan that wasn't specifically looking for anomalies. But what made her stop wasn't the size. It was the timestamp. The file had been created 4 days after Vanta's infrastructure went dark. 4 days after the disappearance of a man who had, by all available evidence, successfully deleted every trace of his existence from the digital surface. A new file appeared in a location with no obvious connection to his known operations. No encryption, no obfuscation. Just sitting there, accessible, like it was waiting. The content of the file was a fragment of code, approximately 40 lines. Incomplete. Deliberately incomplete in a way that made it look like a draft, an abandoned note, something left behind by mistake. The code itself was not immediately alarming. It referenced a type of vulnerability class in industrial control systems, specific, but not classified, the kind of technical content that exists in published research, except for one function, embedded near the bottom of the fragment, 11 lines of logic that, when isolated and analyzed, described a behavior that had no legitimate research application. It wasn't exploitation code. It wasn't a proof of concept. It was something more subtle. A sequence describing how a specific class of sensor-level tamper detection could be bypassed without triggering any observable change in the monitoring layer above it. The researcher forwarded it to a contact at a European cybersecurity firm. That contact escalated it. Within 6 weeks, it had reached an interagency task force whose existence is not publicly confirmed. And this is where the case stops making sense. Because the first assumption, reasonable, logical, consistent with everything known about Vanta's operational profile, was that the file was a test, a deliberate breadcrumb, a way to confirm whether anyone was watching closely enough to find it. Sophisticated actors in his space sometimes do this. They leave controlled signals in low-visibility environments to map the response time and capability of monitoring operations. It's a counterintelligence technique borrowed from tradecraft older than the internet. The file, under this theory, was bait. But then the metadata was analyzed in depth. The file had been created using a software environment that forensic analysis was able to partially reconstruct. And what that reconstruction showed was a machine configuration, operating system patches, installed libraries, software version signatures, that matched a specific profile. Not a profile linked to Vanta's known infrastructure. A profile linked to a device registered to a graduate student at a technical university in Eastern Europe. A real person, with a real identity. With no known connection to Vanta's operations, no known involvement in any underground forum, no prior flag in any database the task force had access to. The graduate student was interviewed. She had no idea what the file was. She had no memory of creating it. She had access to the repository, legitimate access, she used it for her coursework. But she could not explain the file, the timestamp, or how her machine's environment fingerprint ended up attached to it. She wasn't a suspect. She was a data point that didn't fit, which meant one of two things. Either Vanta had access to her system, used it to plant the file, and in doing so, left her fingerprint as a layer of misdirection, which would be extraordinarily sophisticated and would require a level of pre-positioning that suggested the file wasn't improvised but was planned far in advance. Or the fingerprint itself was fabricated, a spoofed environment signature designed to point investigators toward a dead end, which would require technical capability beyond what was expected even from someone with Vanta's profile. Both explanations are possible. Both explanations create new problems. Because if the file was pre-planned, if Vanta had positioned this breadcrumb before he disappeared, as part of the shutdown protocol itself, then the question becomes, why? What does a file like this accomplish? It draws attention to something. It signals capability in a domain that didn't appear in his previous operational profile. Industrial control systems were not Vanta's known specialty. He had never sold anything related to that sector. His forum reputation was built on enterprise IT environments and communications infrastructure, not the operational technology systems that run power grids, water treatment facilities, and manufacturing plants. So why, in his final communication with the world, if that's what this was, did he point directly at that sector? And if the fingerprint was fabricated, then the level of capability required to do it convincingly enough to pass initial forensic review is itself a signal. Not a mistake, not a slip, a deliberate demonstration. This is where the two hypotheses collapse into each other. Because the most unsettling reading of this case isn't that Vanta made a mistake. The most unsettling reading is that he knew exactly what he was doing, and the purpose of the file was not to hide something but to show something. Not a clue left accidentally, a message composed intentionally. And the question the task force couldn't answer, the question that reportedly caused significant internal disagreement, was whether the intended recipient was law enforcement, a client, a competitor, or someone else entirely. There is a third hypothesis, smaller, less discussed, but present in the documentation. The possibility that the file was not created by Vanta at all, that someone else, someone with knowledge of his methods, his infrastructure, his operational patterns, created the file after his disappearance and used a spoofed environment profile to associate it with his known signature. Not to frame him, since he was already gone, but to speak in his name, to use the credibility of his disappearance as a transmission channel, to ensure that whatever was encoded in those 40 lines of code would be taken seriously, analyzed deeply, escalated quickly, because it arrived with the invisible signature of someone whose reputation the intelligence community had spent months trying to locate. This hypothesis requires a separate, unidentified actor with a very specific set of capabilities and a very specific motivation. It has no direct evidentiary support, but it has never been definitively ruled out because the alternative explanations each carry their own structural problems that forensic analysis has not fully resolved. What happened to Vanta after March 2022 is not known. There are unconfirmed reports, sourced from individuals within the cybersecurity research community who spoke on condition of anonymity, that suggest a person matching certain behavioral and technical characteristics consistent with his profile was active in a different operational context, approximately 14 months after the disappearance, under a different alias, in a different sector. But those reports are uncorroborated, and the agencies with the most relevant access have not publicly confirmed or denied them. What is known is this: the file remains. It has been analyzed by multiple independent teams and at least 2 government-adjacent technical bodies. No consensus has been reached on its full meaning or purpose. The vulnerability class it references has been patched in the systems it most directly describes. Whether the patch was implemented because of the file or independently and coincidentally is not confirmed. The graduate student whose machine profile appeared in the metadata has continued her studies without further incident. The repository where the file was found has since been taken offline, its contents archived in a restricted environment that the original researcher no longer has access to. And somewhere in the space between a disappeared man and a file that shouldn't exist, the question no one has been able to answer with confidence still sits. Was it a mistake? Was it a message? Was it a warning? And if it was a warning, was it meant for the people who found it or for someone they hadn't identified yet? The evidence exists, the timeline exists, but even with both on the table, one contradiction refuses to close. Vanta was a person who spent 4 years proving he could leave without leaving anything behind. And then, in the window between his disappearance and complete silence, something appeared that should not have been there. Something specific. Something technically meaningful. Something that required either a catastrophic lapse in judgment from one of the most operationally disciplined figures the Underground had produced in a decade, or a decision. A deliberate, calculated, impossible-to-explain decision. And that is why this case still refuses to make complete sense. Because you can accept the mistake. You can accept the message. What you can't do is accept both at the same time. And every time investigators try to settle on one, the other becomes more convincing. The file keeps pointing somewhere. It just doesn't point cleanly. And somewhere out there, whether in a server room, a safe house, or a jurisdiction where extradition is a theoretical concept, Vanta, or whoever he became after March 2022, already knows whether anyone understood what was left behind. The real question is whether understanding it changes anything, or whether that too, was part of the calculation.